How early in church history did cataphatic prayer appear or originate? And can you scripturally prove the mindset of early Christians? Is there adequate scriptural basis for this, or is this Boydian philosophy?
Yeah, it's Boydian philosophy, but it's still good.
You know, in our book, Jesus Legend, took 4 years from 2003 to 2007. We were researching for that. And one of the main things that Greg and I learned through that process that we didn't know before we started was about the whole world of the ancient world of oral tradition, and how cultures that are not literate, or at least largely not literate, which would have been the first century Mediterranean world, how they process information, how they pass on information, and most of it is by memory. Most of it is, as Greg has pointed out, memory/imagination. It's the same thing. Here's what's fascinating about our text that we find in our Bibles. God did not give us systematic theology textbooks. Most of what we have, both in the Old and in large portions of the New, meaning at least all the Gospels, which is the fundamental teachings of Jesus, and the book of Acts, it's historical narrative. It's narratives that, as you read them, you find yourself imagining. It's stories. Stories we always imagine. We make it part of our mental framework inside. I think part of why that's going on is because in an ancient world where the literacy rate is low, and Jesus is preaching a sermon, and the crowd he's preaching to can't go back and check the references because, first of all, probably no one's writing it down anyway, and even if they did, most of the people couldn't read it. All Jesus has is the ability in this sermon to lodge in their memory, imagination, things that they will retain once he leaves that town and goes to the next to preach through Galilee. So he's using things that are easily remembered, parables, little vignettes, little pieces of narrative information that become part of their memory, i.e. imagination. That's our text. That's our Gospels. So I want to say, from the very beginning, the very way Jesus preached, largely parables and stories, not didactic information. The very way our Gospel authors recorded that, largely narrative, this suggests that imagination and memory was, from the very beginning, the primary way that the Gospel was remembered and recorded and passed on. So I don't think Greg came up with that.
Sure.
That's from the very beginning. That's how oral cultures tend to do things.
You find that even cross-culturally and as far back as you go. It sounds new to us because we are heirs of the Enlightenment, naturalistic, scientific revolution, and we've just had the imagination sort of discredited in our minds, and especially in Christian culture. There's a whole other story to tell here if we had time, but the Protestant Reformation got really paranoid about any kind of statues or whatever, and that's where you got this kind of overreaction against any kind of icons or images or whatever, and that becomes kind of a dominant stream in Protestantism. But the new thing is the absence of the imagination, not the use of the imagination. And you find that throughout all cultures, and it's certainly throughout Scripture. I mean, and I'll say more about this week, so I'm not going to talk a whole lot about this. But when David says, I see the Lord, I love to go to the temple to behold the beauty of the Lord, do you think he's seeing a physical picture of God? No. He's just talking about seeing in the mind. The word for vision and the word for dream in Hebrew, at least the dominant word, means seeing. But what a dream and a vision have in common is that they both occur in the head. When you're dreaming, it's your imagination going on. And throughout the Bible, the assumption is, and I think it's correct, that God talks to us through dreams. God talks to us through visions. And that's a legitimization of the imagination. And so you find throughout the Bible, and the whole vividness of the imagery, God doesn't give us all propositions, or mostly propositions, hardly any abstract theorem propositions. There's stories with concrete images, and the shepherd and the rock, and all these things that have meaning as we envision them. It's just what it means to think. And then moving to the New Testament, as I showed this last week, with 2 Corinthians 3 and 4. Paul very explicitly, over a course of about 20 verses, hammers in how the central point of transformation happens when we see the glory of the Lord in our mind, heart, which we can do now because the veil has been lifted. The God of this age blinds the mind and heart of those who are perishing, so they cannot see the glory of the Lord shining in the face of Jesus Christ. But the Spirit has lifted the veil of the mind and heart, so we can see it, and that's right there in the Bible. And then you find throughout church history, and I'll go into this more this week, but there's a constant stream of folks who understand the power of encountering the living God in Jesus Christ in the spirit, in the heart, in the mind, or what we today would call imagination.